Rory McIlroy just called part of the PGA Tour's new system a glorified developmental tour, on camera at the US Open 1 week before the official announcement, and then issued a statement supporting the same system 4 days later. Both things happened in the same week, on the record. This is not about one player's opinion on a schedule. The PGA Tour just approved a two-tier system that takes effect in 2028 and restructures how 230 professional golfers compete, earn, and keep their jobs. Historic tournaments like the Canadian Open are now at risk of landing in the second tier, and the man who spent 3 years as the tour's loudest defender just said that second tier is going to be a glorified corn ferry to official supporter in 4 days is the most damaging thing he has done to his own credibility since he almost left the tour during the LIV war, and the tour knows it. Do you think McIlroy's public criticism before the announcement was genuine, or was it a negotiating tactic that got him a private phone call with Roll App? Drop it in the comments right now. And stay with me, because what Golf Digest wrote about McIlroy's pattern of position changes is the analysis that reframes his entire role in the tour's power structure, and I'm not getting to it until later in this video. To understand what just happened with the PGA Tour's two-tier announcement, you need to understand what the tour promised players 3 years ago, and how far the reality has drifted from that promise. In 2023, when the war with LIV was at its most intense and the framework agreement created a genuine crisis inside the sport, the narrative the tour built for itself was about player unity. We are standing together. The players who stayed are protecting something worth protecting. The structure will be reformed, yes, but reformed in ways that reflect what the players actually need. McIlroy was the face of that unity. He sat in press rooms and took questions about Jon Rahm's departure, about Bryson's defection, about whether the tour could survive. He gave the tour's best arguments in its hardest moments. He described the PGA Tour as the right place to be, the place worth fighting for, the organization that could deliver a better future if players stayed together.
That was the promise. What he said at the US Open this year, weeks before the structure those players stayed to defend was officially unveiled, was this: Track 2 is a glorified corn ferry event. Like, that's what Track 2 is going to be. Here's the specific number that makes that sentence devastating in context. The PGA Tour's yearly schedule has approximately 40 events total. The new system preserves 47 events across both tiers. The top championship series will have around 23 to 24 events, including majors, the Players' Championship, signature events, and the Tour Championship.
The bottom Challenger Series will have the remaining events, including potentially the Canadian Open, the RBC Heritage, and other tournaments that have existed on the main tour for decades.
One year, a player like Nick Taylor won the Canadian Open on the main tour. In 2028, he might need to play it in the second tier, unless the Canadian Open sponsor pays $30 million to be elevated. None of that fully explains why McIlroy went from glorified corn ferry on Tuesday to official statement of support on Sunday. That pivot is coming. Here is the full quote. US Open at Shinnecock Hills, pre-tournament media availability, Tuesday, June 17, 2026.
McIlroy was asked what concerns he had about the two-tier changes and their effects on players. He started by saying he didn't really know. Then he got specific. I guess just recency, an event like last week, the Canadian Open, potentially going to one of these Track 2s. Track 2 is a glorified corn ferry event, like that's what Track 2 is going to be. So I don't think the Canadian Open should be one of those. I just think there's going to be certain events that might lose their stature if a sponsor doesn't pony up $30 million. So that's the tough thing. Then he added something that cuts even deeper, and which nobody in the initial coverage treated as the lead. I think as they've done all this work, you start to realize that the way the tour was before LIV came along was actually pretty good. It was a pretty good structure, and everything sort of worked pretty well. Read that second part carefully. You spent 3 years watching McIlroy be the tour's most vocal defender during the LIV war. You watched him attack LIV players at press conferences, go on record supporting the framework agreement, describe himself as someone who suffered for the tour during the conflict. And now, in the week before the tour unveils the new structure that supposedly makes everything better, he is saying the old structure, the one LIV disrupted, was actually pretty good. He did not say the new system is better. He said the old one worked pretty well. That is not a man who is enthusiastic about where this is going. But it gets more complicated than the quote itself, because 4 days after saying all of that at Shinnecock, McIlroy issued an official statement, a prepared, formal, publicist-drafted statement, and it said, "Today's announcement is a positive step for professional golf. As more details emerge, it is encouraging to see the PGA Tour reaffirming the importance of meritocracy and creating a structure that will serve both players and fans well into the future. I've always been proud to compete around the world, and the collaboration between the PGA Tour and DP World Tour is one founded in the betterment of the game globally. The man who said, "glorified Corn Ferry event" 4 days earlier, was now calling it a positive step for professional golf.
Both of those statements were made by the same person in the same week about the same policy. And Golf Digest, which has covered McIlroy's position changes for 3 years, described his pattern of public pivots as now legend. The word legend was not a compliment. Is McIlroy's pivot from critic to supporter damaging his credibility with other players? Or is this just an elite athlete being pragmatic about organizational politics?
Here is what happened between those two statements. Rolap had a private phone call with McIlroy before the formal announcement. After that call, Rolap said publicly, "I had a chance to speak with Rory today. We talked a bit about it, and I think he's made some comments publicly since then." Which comments did Rolap mean? The supportive, official statement, the one that arrived after the private call. And just when you think this is only about McIlroy playing both sides, other players stepped forward with positions that actually stayed consistent, and what they said applies direct pressure on the tour's announcement in ways that the official statement cannot neutralize. We'll get to that. Here is what the PGA Tour promised the players who stayed through the LIV conflict. The promise was specific. It was made by Jay Monahan, repeated by McIlroy in press rooms, and reinforced in the framework agreement. The players who stayed would have a voice in building the tour's future structure. The changes that came out of the LIV era would be designed with input from the athletes who sacrificed commercial opportunities by choosing not to defect. What players gave up? Commercial opportunities from LIV's guaranteed contracts, which ranged from $20 million for mid-ranked players to $200 million for top names. Players like Cameron Smith and Dustin Johnson left and secured those packages. Players who stayed did so partly because they believed the tour would deliver a reformed structure that respected their competitive and financial interests.
How the tour broke it. The two-tier system creates promotion and relegation between tiers, which means a player ranked 131st in the Championship Series at season's end gets relegated to the Challenger Series. Once in the Challenger Series, a player can only be promoted by performing well there, not by winning elsewhere in the world. Players will be forbidden from moving between the tiers outside of those specific mechanisms. Put yourself in the position of a player currently ranked 130th in the world. You stayed through the LIV War. You kept your PGA Tour card. You have been competing on the main tour for 8 years. And in 2028, if you finish 131st in the Championship Series, you are relegated to a tier that the world's most prominent active player just described as a glorified developmental tour.
What do you say? Nick Taylor said it clearly. When reporters asked him at the Canadian Open how he would feel if he could not play in his National Open because of his tier ranking, his answer was, "That would certainly suck." That is not an angry quote. That is an honest one, and it represents the reaction of the majority of players who are not in the top 50 of the world, but who built careers on tour based on an understanding that their national events were accessible to them. Here is the question that nobody in the tour's leadership has answered directly. If a Canadian-born PGA Tour player cannot enter the Canadian Open because he is in the wrong...
McIlroy asked the same thing, from a different angle. He said national opens need to be treated differently. He said, "We've got to be careful with that, because then these national opens lose the fabric of what they are. You can't call yourself a national open anymore if it's a closed-off tournament and there's a certain number of guys." He said that publicly. Then he put out a statement calling the whole thing a positive step. The Canadian Open does not have a statement. Now here is the part nobody has properly connected. Tiger Woods led the Future Competition Committee. This was the internal PGA Tour body that designed the two-tier system now taking effect in 2028. Tiger sat on the board as a player director, chaired the committee responsible for the competitive structure, and drove the merit-based philosophy that underpins the entire Championship Series and Challenger Series framework. Tiger is not currently playing on tour. He has played in a handful of events in the last 3 years. He has made no cuts. His competitive status is effectively ceremonial at this point, while his governance role shaped a structure that will define the careers of 230 active players.
The man who built the new meritocracy for the PGA Tour has not competed meaningfully in it for years. That is not a knock on Tiger's contributions or his knowledge of the game. It is a specific observation about the gap between the people designing systems and the people living inside them.
a player who will never face relegation to the Challenger Series, designed the relegation mechanism. A player whose historic legacy insulates him from any commercial consequence of PGA Tour restructuring, set the terms for players whose livelihoods depend on tier placement. Nobody covered this angle. They covered the announcement, they covered McIlroy's pivot. They missed the authorship question entirely.
After McIlroy's Shinnecock comments circulated, Rolap addressed them directly. His counter was measured and specific. He said, "I had a chance to speak with Rory today. We talked a bit about it, and I think he's made some comments publicly since then. But I think the best way to think about what we're doing here is that right now we have 47 events at the PGA Tour. We'll have 47 events going forward. That current model serves roughly 230 players. We'll serve that amount of players the same. That is the CEO's version of nothing is being taken away. Same number of events, same number of players served."
But look at what Rolap's response does not say. He does not say the Canadian Open will be in the Championship Series. He does not say historic national events are protected from relegation to the Challenger Series. He says the number of events stays the same. That is a math answer to a values question. McIlroy asked whether national opens retain their identity if they are in the second tier. Rolap answered with a head count. Those two things are not the same conversation, and the difference between them is the gap where players' real concerns live. Rolap also framed the entire system around meritocracy. The competitive meritocracy that makes this sport great and unique, we've gotten away from, and we're getting back to it.
That sounds clean. Meritocracy is a word everyone supports in principle. Is Rolap's same number of events, same number of players argument an adequate response to McIlroy's National Open concern, or is it dodging the real question? Comment: adequate response or dodging the real issue? The meritocracy argument also has a specific irony built into it. The tour moved away from meritocracy partly because of the signature event model, the very structure that concentrated elite players in premium events regardless of recent form. Rolap is now positioning the new system as a return to merit, but the Championship Series still includes signature events. The top tier is not purely merit-based. It is a hybrid of invitation. You cannot run a pure meritocracy and simultaneously require that sponsors pay $30 million to keep events in the top tier. Those two things are in tension, and nobody in any of the official communications has resolved that tension. The Open Championship at Royal Birkdale is 10 days away. The Tour's 2028 structure announcement is done. The implementation timeline is public. And the conversation that has been building since Rolap's March announcement about which events stay in the Championship Series, which get relegated, and how sponsors respond to the pressure of maintaining tier status is about to play out at every tournament between now and 2028. Here is the counterintuitive number. The Rocket Classic in Detroit was specifically cited in the coverage of this announcement as an example of what happens to an event that cannot fund Tier 1 status. The Rocket Classic used to be a full PGA Tour event. It lost its title sponsor, it could not secure a replacement at the required level, its status on the tour calendar diminished. That is not a hypothetical. That is a precedent that already happened before the new system. Under the new system, with $30 million explicitly described as the threshold for Championship Series elevation, the Canadian Open is a national event with a government relationship and a 70-plus year history on the PGA Tour. It is also, in McIlroy's exact framing, the kind of event that might lose its stature if a sponsor doesn't pony up $30 million. The last time a historic national event lost its place in the top tier of professional golf was the HSBC Champions in China, which was a flagship DP World Tour event for nearly 2 decades. It lost sanctioning during the COVID period and never fully recovered its competitive status. The players who had built their off-season schedule around it, particularly Asian Tour members who used it as a gateway event, saw that history disappear in a 2-year window. The Canadian Open is not in that position yet, but it is in the conversation. And the man who described that conversation most vividly, glorified Korn Ferry event, then issued a supportive. Here is the pattern this entire 2-tier situation reveals about how the PGA Tour makes decisions that affect the lives of 230 professional athletes. The process begins behind closed doors. Rolap convenes a committee. Tiger Woods chairs it. A framework is developed over months. Players are briefed, which is a different thing from consulted. Then the plan is announced as final or near final, and the public communication stage begins. At that point, the only lever players have is the press room. McIlroy used the press room. He said glorified Korn Ferry event at Shinnecock Hills. Rolap called him privately. 4 days later, McIlroy issued a statement of support.
Here is the question that process raises for every player not named Rory McIlroy. If the most prominent and well-connected player on the tour can publicly call a core element of the new structure a developmental circuit, and then reverse that position after a private phone call with the CEO, what leverage does a player ranked 95th have when he has a concern about how tier placement affects his ability to play in his home country's National Open? Nick Taylor said it would certainly suck. He did not get a private phone call. Eddie Pepperell warned about the concentration of PGA Tour resources affecting international circuits. Nobody called him.
The players with concerns got nothing. The player with a megaphone got a phone call and a chance to reverse his public position before the announcement. That is the system. It has always been the system. But it is worth naming clearly now. In the week the most consequential restructuring in PGA Tour history was formally approved. The tour's communication to players is not a dialogue. It is a series of briefings followed by a window where public dissent is tolerated, managed privately through calls to the most influential voices, and then neutralized before the official announcement.
McIlroy was the most influential voice. He got the call, he changed his statement. And the Canadian Open is still potentially going to be a Challenger Series event in 2028. Nothing about that outcome was meritocracy. Is the PGA Tour's two-tier system genuinely better?
Rory McIlroy spent 3 years as the PGA Tour's most important player spokesperson during the hardest period in the organization's history. He took the bullets, as Golf Digest described it. He defended the tour when the tour needed defending. And then, in the week the tour unveiled the structure all of that defending was supposed to produce, he walked into a Shinnecock Hills press room and said that structure's second tier was a glorified developmental circuit. He was right. Then he issued a statement saying he was wrong. Then he played golf somewhere else instead of the Travelers Championship while the announcement was being made.
That sequence, correct criticism, private call, public reversal, absent from the scene, is the best description of McIlroy's relationship with the tour's power structure that the last 3 years have produced. Tiger Woods built the system. Rolab announced it. McIlroy endorsed it after criticizing it. And Nick Taylor, sitting at the Canadian Open worried about whether he can play in his national championship in 2028, is waiting for someone to explain whether any of this was built for him. The Open at Royal Birkdale starts in 10 days. McIlroy will be there, defending champion. Scheffler will be there, chasing the jug. The two-tier announcement will fade into the background for a week while the sport's best players compete on links grass.
But the Canadian Open question, the National Open question, and the promotion relegation mechanism will still be there when Birkdale ends. And by 2028, someone ranked 131st in the Championship Series will find out exactly what the new meritocracy means for them. Subscribe and you will see the Birkdale coverage in real time, and the full breakdown of what the two-tier structure produces in its first events when 2028 arrives.